From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome back to Rare Book and Special Collections Division. I'm Mark Domination. I'm chief of the division here. You're in for a real treat today. We're very excited to have Valerie Lester here, who'll be speaking on her biography of Bodoni, the first in the English language, yes?
Yes.
Yes. You will find some very interesting things about Bodoni, who's the creator, for those of you who don't live in my world, of 18th century typeface, perhaps one of the most elegant typefaces developed. But there's many interesting parallels between Bodoni and the biography and the biographer. Bodoni's font is, among other things, noted for high contrast between thins and thicks, and thick and black and very narrow. And in certain moments in reading this type, it creates what's called dazzle, which is a vibration that's caused by the relationship between thin and thick. And Bodoni's life itself is full, as we have learned in the biography, of something far more than you would imagine of a typographer, full of dazzle and highs and lows and thicks and thins. And so you'll have the experience of learning and hearing about that today from Valerie Lester, whose own experience as a biographer parallels this kind of experience that Bodoni's type has created for us, which is a lot of dazzle. Coming to Italian later in life, yes, in order to conduct this biography. She also comes from a perspective a little outside our field, which means that it's opened up to receive Bodoni as a full-fledged, fleshed-out individual, and not merely a typographer, but somebody who lived life with a good deal of gusto. So we're very thrilled to have her here. This is an important book. She's been on a book tour already, and this is already quite a phenomenon. But before she gets up to speak, I thought we can't have such an elevated individual here without at least telling a few stories about her. So I've asked Stan Nelson to actually introduce her. So Stan, come on up.
This is going to be impromptu. I hadn't planned on this. Valerie contacted me with questions about the process of punch cutting, and it became very evident that it would be just best to have her come visit me. So she journeyed to the wild and wonderful West Virginia and joined me in my studio for a couple of days, and we were cutting punches, and she got her hands dirty and learned something really real about this process of shaping letters in steel. And I think as a result began to understand just what an incredible accomplishment that Bodoni had achieved in his life with all of the vast variety of typefaces that were produced. And I, of course, I had a wonderful time working with Valerie, and I was quite impressed with her ability to absorb all of this material. She was carrying with her when she arrived several wonderful books in Italian, and it was very evident as we looked at those that the problem has been that this material was not available in English. The Italians have produced wonderful books about Bodoni, but not books that I could really appreciate other than look at the pictures. I understand better my grandchildren looking at books and going, oh, not getting the text. So you're going to have a very enjoyable time hearing about this project and what she's accomplished. It's a really remarkable achievement.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for having me here. Thank you, Stan, for introducing me and for your hospitality. And thank you all for coming. This is great. Bodoni. All right. Born in Saluzzo in Piemonte, which is northwest Italy, in 1740. He apprenticed in Rome, and then he spent his professional life in Parma, which is in north central Italy. This is the town in which he was born, and it's absolutely gorgeous. It's off the beaten path, and if you walk up any of the narrow little streets, you see this massive mountain, which is called Monviso. It's the highest mountain in the Cottian Alps, and it has 3 sources of the River Po. They join together as they come off the mountain. They go through Saluzzo and then the mighty Po makes its way across the entire north of Italy and eventually mouths into the Adriatic. This is the house in which he was born. And any of you speak Italian? Well, if you did, you would understand that it is now a dry cleaning and dyeing establishment. The plaque on the wall here tells you that his date of birth is February the 26th, not the 16th as recorded by his principal Italian biographer. So I think this is right. Here's Bedoni's grandfather on the left and his father on the right. He came from a family of printers. Even on his mother's side, there was printing. His grandfather before him went to Rome to get training, and his father, I don't think his father actually went to Rome, but try to remember that style of printing on the right, his father's style, and you will see it again. This is the schoolroom. Well, this is the school in which Bedoni studied in Saluzzo. And I understand that in the winter, when it was very cold, they would put wax paper over the windows in order to seal in. You imagine it's pretty cold up near Monviso in the winter. When he was 17, nearly 18, he and a good friend decided that they would go and conquer Rome. Bedoni wanted to become the greatest printer who ever lived, and his friend wanted to become the greatest servant of God who ever lived. So off they set, these two boys, and made a journey which was described as one of the writers in Italian about him as arduous and fatiguing to Rome, as indeed I'm sure it was to travel in those days. So they arrived in Rome and found it very difficult to find work. And it was really challenging. And in fact, the young proto-priest went back home, where he did become a parish priest, and they remained in touch. Bedoni hung on, and eventually he found his way to the College of the Propaganda Fide. The Propaganda Fide being the missionary arm of the Vatican, and thus an establishment that printed Bibles and missals in exotic languages in order to convert people in the Middle East and the Far East. So already there was exotic type at the Propaganda Fide when Bedoni arrived. He so impressed Cardinal Spinelli, who was the head of the Propaganda Fide, with his little wood engravings. He took these along as samples of what he could do. And the story goes that Cardinal Spinelli gave him a test, asked him to design and cut a coat of arms in a couple of hours or something. Well, Bedoni, of course, managed, and he was hired on the spot. Spinelli also took him into his own home, which will happen to be the Palazzo Valentini, which is the building on the right side here. So Bedoni, let's imagine he was up in one of, lowly apprentice, up in one of those skylit rooms up top there. So in the morning, he could roll out of bed and just walk down into the Forum of Trajan and find himself face to face with some of the most important lettering ever cut. His first task, not his first task. He started very low. He did anything, he was a kind of dog's body there. But he eventually started composing, and the first book he worked on was what's called a pontificale, a book for bishops, of services that bishops would give. And this is actually quite interesting and rare. On the left, you have the first run, Bodoni's first run at doing this. And so it's printed in 2 colors. It's printed in 2 languages, Coptic and Arabic. The powers that be were so impressed by what he could do that they then went on to print lots more copies and allowed him to sign his name. No, to print his name, it's not a signature, to print his name at the bottom, which is very unusual for a lowly typesetter, but they were so pleased about it. Now, the one on the left is actually in the Houghton Library at Harvard, and it's quite a big book, and it has in pencil written in it, very rare. So I was absolutely fascinated because I went back to Parma in February and presented the book, which was a wonderful moment for me to go back to the city where I'd worked so hard with an actual product, which I'm not convinced that they thought I was capable of doing, but I did. So I showed this image, and they had never seen it. So it is indeed very rare, the one on the left. Bodoni worked for 6 years in Rome, and then you know how things come together to make you make some kind of move in life. His Cardinal Spinelli died, and Bodoni's immediate superior, Abbe Ruggieri, killed himself, shot himself. And this was a terrible, terrible thing for Bodoni because they were very close, and Bodoni, Ruggieri was a depressive, but he found relief from depression in the company of Bodoni. Bodoni was very vibrant, and so Bodoni in the mornings would go over to Abbe Ruggieri's home, and he would wait for him until he was ready, and then they would walk together to the Propaganda Fide. On this morning, Bodoni went over, the servant told him that the Abbe was not ready, and then there was the sound of a shot, and he had killed himself. Now, if you think about the circumstances there, how terrible that must have been for Bodoni, and you wonder about Ruggieri's motivation in killing himself at that very moment. It's kind of one of these unsolved mysteries, but it set Bodoni up for wanting to leave Rome. On the brighter side, Bodoni had met quite a few English tourists in Rome, part of the Grand Tour. They were, there also carting goods back to England, to museums and to their stately homes in England from Italy. And they told him that, there are things happening in England. There's quite a lot of innovation going on. There's this chap called Baskerville. And Bodoni thought, I want to stretch my wings. I will go to England. Never mind that I don't speak English. Everybody in England will speak Italian because they like opera. So off he went, and he decided that he would stop and see his parents on the way in Saluzzo, because it's directly north, and then he would go on to England. But on the way, he fell ill, and we think it was malaria, and he was quite ill. So he went home to his mother, and she took care of him, and when he recovered, he started working again with his father in the family print works. In the meantime, in Parma, the young 18-year-old Duke of Parma and his wonderfully attractive Prime Minister, Guillaume Dutilio, wanted to put Parma on the map. And how did you do that in those days? Well, you did that by setting up a print works in your city so that you could advertise your city as being quite the most marvelous and charming place in Italy. But how could they go about it? How could they set out to just start a print works and a press from nothing. Well, Guillaume de Tillot, being French, consulted a great connoisseur in Paris called Pierre-Jean Mariette. Pierre-Jean Mariette was a wise man, and he said, do not hire a Frenchman. Hire an Italian, because you're going to be printing a lot of works in Italian. You want to get them right, hire Italian. The problem was there were no Italians suitable for the job. So there was a librarian, in Parma, Paolo Maria Paciaudi, who had known Bodoni in Rome, and coincidentally, they were both from Piedmont. They were both Piemontesi, and they stick together, Piemonteses. So he said, I've met this young man in Rome, and he is incredibly talented. He is absolutely superb. By this time, Bodoni had cut some punches. He had designed title pages. He had worked with exotic type. In fact, while he was in Rome, he was sent to La Sapienza, University of Rome, where he studied Hebrew and Arabic. So he had working knowledge of some exotic languages. And Paciaudi said, I think he would do. So the Duke and the Prime Minister sent off the invitation, and in February 1768, Bodoni arrived in Parma. They set up the print works and his apartment above. That's called the Palazzo della Pilota. And it's an extraordinary building built by the Farnese family, which includes the Farnese Theatre, which is absolutely gigantic. And they could flood the floor and produce naval battles, in it. It's quite an extraordinary place. So Bodoni could print something off, cross the bridge over the river, and arrive at the ducal palace and show the Duke anything that, if he needed his approval. Bodoni liked his food. He had come from Rome, where the food is very kind of vegetable-based, olive oil, very healthy. Parma, on the other hand, you've heard of Parma ham, you've heard of Parma cheese. It's a very, very protein-driven diet, mostly pork. It's a lot of pork. And of course, I meant to tell you, that's tortelli d'erbette, which is a sort of ravioli-like pasta that contains Swiss chard or beet greens. Do you know what we have here? Can you tell what we have here? On the left, yes, we do indeed have the sausage maker. So this is in the 11th century baptistry, so already in Parma, they were devoted to their salami. When Bodoni arrived, I think he brought a few punches of his own, but there was nothing. There was nothing in Parma. So he had to order type from France. And his great hero in printing was Fournier. And so he ordered Fournier type. So in the beginning, Bodoni is Fournier. And gradually, as time went on, Fournier became Bodoni. This, I think you will feel, reminds you of his father's work. It's still old-fashioned, his father's work. So this is, I think this is the very first thing he actually printed in Parma of substance. And it is, it's essentially a poem of thanksgiving for the recovery from, once again, malaria of Prime Minister Dutilio. The next big work was a presentation volume for the marriage of the Duke of Parma, 18 years old, with this Archduchess of Austria, one of the 16 children of Maria Theresa of Austria. At this point, Maria Theresa had a rather lot of marriageable daughters that she needed to get out in the world. So she sent this one to Parma to marry the Duke of Parma. She sent Marie Antoinette to Paris to marry the Dauphin of France, and Carolina to Naples to marry the King of Naples. This one, as you can probably tell, is a piece of work. She's very Austrian. She Austrianized Parma. She got rid of Guillaume de Tillot, and it became a very different place while she was there. Anyway, to go back to this fabulous presentation volume that they produced in celebration of the wedding, Bodoni worked in concert with Petitot, who was an architect. He had come to Parma to brighten the face of Parma, to build a few new buildings and to kind of rehab others. He was very gifted, and he and Bodoni worked hand in glove on the book that you will see at the bottom of this picture on the left. Petitot was so pleased with the finished volume that he produced a funny little book called A Masquerade à la Grecque, in which everybody in it is dressed up in some form of Greek outfit. Anyway, there's the book again, up on the left, on top of the column. And here's the title page. Now you see the difference between that and the previous thing I showed you. It's getting more Bodoni-like. So within this volume, this great big folio volume, there are lots of illustrations, and there are illustrations of battles and uniforms, and this is a Chinese fair, and this is an Arcadian idyll. So the festivities went on for weeks, and one of the performers was a local soprano called affectionately La Bastardella, because her ancestry was a little suspect. But she sang in operas in celebration, and these were operas by Gluck. And I take a very close look at the next image. You know what's going on here?
False bottom.
Buttock enhancement. The pot down on the bottom right has the words Colla di Parma. Colla means glue, and the man doing the enhancement his name is Giuseppe Di Colla, a lot of play on words here, and he actually married Lucrezia Agujari, to give her full name. And then at the end of the final thing, of course, is fireworks. Bodoni was starting by now. Fournier, gradually some of the Fournier type was breaking down. Bodoni was cutting his own to replace it. So the shift is going on between Fournier and Bodoni. Bodoni wanted to produce a specimen book of ornaments. So this page is of his hand drawing of ornaments, which is also at the Houghton Library at Harvard. And he produced this is a facsimile of it, and this is still very like Fournier. Fournier has one of these specimen books that has a cover very like this. And that's from the interior. And do any of you recognize this? It's actually modern-day ITC Bodoni, designed by Sumner Stone. Some of you may know him. And so you can actually decorate your work with this. This is not Bodoni's studio, but it's contemporary. So his print works would have looked very much like this. People would have been wearing the same things. They would have been using the same kind of equipment. There are big windows that face out towards the river. So that's very, very much like what he would have, the space he would have worked in. Here are some of his punches, and the Bodoni Museum has them all. Huge collection of punches. Really, really wonderful collection. These are Bodoni's matrices and molds. This is not his press, but it's a facsimile. He had 6 presses going at one point, at one time, and but none of them remain, but they managed to get a facsimile of one of them. This book is over on that table. I'm very pleased that we can see that book. An Epithalamia is a book written in celebration of a wedding. And the wedding was that of the Prince of Piedmont. So we're back in Piedmont, loyalty among Piemontese. And the Prince of Piedmont married Marie Clotilde, the Princess of France, a Princess of France. So Bodoni produced another marvelous presentation volume. And what he did in it was he had 26 pages, each with a different language, different exotic type, and the iconography for the city that it represented, the city in Piemonte that it represented. So this is the page for Saluzzo, for his hometown. For some reason, he chose to use Armenian as the script, and the image above is of, it's actually got the rivers, the tributaries of the Po and various other items of interest to Saluzzo. Well, that particular book made such an impression on the Spanish ambassador, who lived in Rome but came to Parma and was astounded by Bodoni's talent. And he felt very, very strongly that Bodoni was wasting himself in Parma when he should be actually in Rome. He felt that Bodoni was printing just ephemera. He was printing announcements, invitations, playbills, and silly sonnets for would-be poets who wanted their work printed by the great Bodoni. And he said, if you come to Rome, I will give you your own establishment, and you will publish the classics. You will not have to do any of this essentially grunt work. So come to Rome, come to Rome, come to Rome. Well, Bodoni liked Parma. He was comfortable in Parma. However, in 1791, when the pressure was really on from Dea Sara to go to Rome, and Bodoni was beginning to weaken and think that, might be a good idea, the Duke heard about it. And he really didn't want to let Bodoni go, because Bodoni was, he was like a rock star by this time. He attracted people to Parma. Tourists came to Parma, and they went first to see Bodoni before they paid tribute to the Duke. He was, it's hard to imagine nowadays, but it was, it was like, what's his name? Steve Jobs, right? Somebody like that. Star quality, big name. So the Duke said, no, I can't let you go. You must stay here, but here's what I'll do. I'll give you your own private press. So you can print anything you want, so long as you just stay here and print what I want. So that's the deal they cut. Well, immediately, Azara commissioned him to produce Horace. And now you see the Bodoni doing what he wanted, expressing himself as Bodoni with his perfect balance, his black ink on really good white paper, his own recipe for his ink. And so from then on, his work just got better and better. But there was another reason why Bodoni wanted to stay in Parma. What do you think that was? Well, you may be wondering about romance in Bodoni's life. He's by now 51. And I've scratched around trying to find anything, any whiff of scandal, but you can make guesses. And I certainly have, but you know, as a biographer, you got to hew to the facts. So anyway, at the age of 51, he had begun to suffer from the terrible gout that pursued him for the rest of his life. And I think the idea of a little sort of home comfort seemed really good. He had come to know this young woman, Margherita Dall'Aglio, but she was unfortunately engaged to somebody else. But Bodoni was so famous and so attractive that she managed to get rid of the other guy. So they got married. It's the little chapel in which they got married in Parma. But all was not entirely well in this big year of 1791. There you go, Stan. Bodoni had hired some metal workers from San Pancrazio, which is a village outside Parma, who proved to be really useful working with him, 2 brothers and a nephew. And this is murky territory, right? This is murky territory. He taught them how to cut punches, and so they were working alongside him. But they began to feel that they were doing all this work, but they weren't getting the acknowledgement. So there was a terrific rift, and they left and started their own print works in San Pancrazio. So I thought it would be interesting for you to see their work compared to Bodoni's. And I think you recognize the master, don't you? There. Round about the same time, Didot in France, the great French printer, got hold of a copy of Bodoni's Aeneid. Now, he may have got hold of a final copy, but Bodoni believed he'd got hold of an uncorrected proof. And it's possible that the Amoretti brothers had been the ones to get this uncorrected proof to Paris. As I say, this is murky stuff. It's not definitive. Didot then produced his own Aeneid, and in the introduction, he took Bodoni to task and listed his typos, which I think is actually just about as cruel a thing as you can do to a competitor. However, in the end, they learned to admire each other greatly, and I'm not sure that all was forgiven, but certainly matters improved. I think Didot had to back off a little bit when Bodoni won a very prestigious prize for printing in France that no foreigner had ever won. He was a workaholic, and if he wasn't actually designing or printing, he was cutting punches. He cut thousands and thousands of punches. But I think this is the influence of Signora Bodoni, that they would have conversazioni on Friday afternoons. They would gather their friends together and enjoy themselves. I don't see any wine, but maybe it's a little early in the day. But anyway, it's a very interesting image to read. On the far left, you have Bodoni, and next to him is Giuseppe Di Lama, who would go on to write the main biography, the biography that people always use and quote from, but gets the birth date wrong. Sorry. So they're clearly working on something together. Maybe Bodoni's telling him a bit of his life story. Behind them is Dal Mastro, the manservant for the Bodonis. In the center are three good friends from Parma, rather well-born. One's a poet, one's a count. I forget what the third one is. Top right is Zambiaghi, the foreman of the printworks. And then down below, clustered slightly, is Signora Bodoni and Fernando Payer, who was a composer who wrote the wedding march for Napoleon's second wedding. This is Rosa Spina, Francesco Rosa Spina, who was the one engraver that Bodoni trusted to do illustrations for him. Bodoni very rarely used illustrations, but when he did, he trusted Rosa Spina.
Was Fournier still alive?
You know, I can't think, I'm not sure of the date I'm not sure of the dates, sorry. I think not. No, I think Fournier died and the Didos had come on in France, right. This is Pietro Miliani, who was a papermaker from Fabriano, where Fabriano still produces really good paper. He provided Bodoni with fantastic paper. The papermaker in Parma, people were jealous of Bodoni and of the kind of sinecure he had at with the Duke at the court. And so he had to go to can you see?
Yes.
There's a seat over here. Well, anyway, good. I'm glad you could. So, so Miliani was very loyal and kept on producing the good stuff. Recognize this chap? Franklin wrote a fan letter to Bodoni, and it's very interesting. He said, "Oh, congratulations on your marvelous work in such and such a work. I really think it's absolutely beautiful. However, had it been me, I would have done such and such." So you know, printers they like a bit of rivalry. The Pope went to Paris to crown Napoleon emperor, and while he was in Paris, he met Marcel, who was the young librarian at the Bibliothèque Impériale. And Marcel showed the Pope this incredible volume he had just produced, which included 150 different types, many, many exotic languages. And the Pope was deeply impressed. On his way back to Rome after what must have been a really discouraging moment for him, crowning Napoleon, he stopped in Parma, went to see Bodoni and said, "Okay, can you do better than this?" Well, could he? Yeah, of course he could. 155. So he did it. So this is from that work, which is an absolutely astonishing thing. The Chinese lettering is interesting in it because it was the only type that he cut in wood. Everything else he had cut in steel, but the Chinese he did in wood. And do you know why he would have done that? Do you know what? Would it have been hard to do that on the steel?
Well, it's really easier in the wood.
Easier in the wood, right, right. Another wonderful moment for Bodoni was when he became an Arcadian, which was a somewhat slightly closed society of people who were interested in keeping the arts and writing alive. So this is quite a big piece of ephemera, if you will, printed in 2 colors, and it's a poem that Bodoni wrote in thanks to the man who proposed him to become an Arcadian. This is in the Providence Public Library, which has the D.B. Updike collection, and which fabulous collection. Which is interesting. I only somehow or other I'd missed it. I came to it right at the end of writing the book, and I literally had to say, "No, hang on, hold the presses, stop. I need more time." And Parma, which was not inclined to think too highly of people who were not actually born in Parma, and that remains to this day. I mean, Parma is very pleased with itself. Why would we go anywhere else when Parma is so perfect? Well, they finally produced the gold medal in honor of Bodoni. Remember the Duke, right? Bodoni's still working for the Duke. The Duke was pious to a fare-thee-well. A religious bigot, actually. But he was also a roisterer. In the country, outside Parma, he has a hunting lodge and a chapel next to it. So he could go off roistering on Saturday evenings and then go to chapel on Sunday. Anyway, he did love to eat, and he doesn't look so good, does he? Anyway, he died in 1802, and it was a sudden and mysterious death. So in Italy, when there is a sudden and mysterious death, what do they figure out? It's poison, right? So that, in actual fact, I've seen carved on a plaque on the church where he's buried. He says he was envelenato, he was poisoned. But in actual fact, I've seen the doctor's records, and I think he had something that's sort of like a twisted gut, black bile, they called it. So anyway, his having died, the Duchess became a co-regent with 2 others, but within 10 days, Napoleon had banished her. There he is, in the robes of the King of Italy. So she was banished, and he put in place this man, Moreau de Saint-Méry, as general administrator of Parma. Now, Bodoni didn't care who he worked for so long as he got commissions and he got paid. He went with the wind. He was apolitical. Bodoni thought of Bodoni. He didn't think particularly of loyalty or of causes. He thought about printing the best books. So he and Moreau became really good friends. Then he printed his Homer. Took a long, long time, and he had a very, very slow editor. But it is the most gorgeous book I have ever seen. It is, I first saw it in Saluzzo, in Bodoni's hometown. Bodoni had given copies of all his books to Saluzzo. So I was there in the library, and the librarian Giancarla Bertero. She came staggering out with a trolley, 3 huge volumes, it's very big. And she took one off and opened it on the table at which I was working. And I thought, I want to die here. This is so beautiful. I want to lie down in this book and die. It was so gorgeous. And it is in fact his favorite font, as we call it nowadays, his favorite type. He said that the Greek was the one he loved most. Well, maybe he got a lot of practice with it. I was certainly working on this book. So, yeah, keeping up with, not exactly the Joneses, but with Napoleon, he gave a copy to Napoleon. And Napoleon was so pleased with it that he made him a Chevalier of the Order of the Union and gave him a pension for life. Napoleon, by now, had gotten rid of Josephine, and he married he was 39, he married the 18-year-old Marie Louise of Austria, related to the Duchess of Parma, but not related closely. Napoleon wanted one thing, and she produced it, a son. This drawing is perfectly charming. I was in a museum called the Glauco Lombardi Museum in Parma. In the back offices talking to the curator, and it was on her desk, this little image, and I said, could I take a photo of this? And she said, oh, sure. So you stumble on wonderful things when you actually spend time in a place. So to celebrate the birth of the King of Rome, Napoleon's son, Bedoni did another of these fabulous presentation volumes. And unusually for his late work, he puts a border around it. But as you can see, it's a very sort of austere, grand border. So it's a celebration of the arrival of the King of Rome. Still hanging in with the Napoleon family, he started working for Murat, who is, I like to call him the hot dresser. Look at his green suede boots, for instance. Anyway, Murat was married to Napoleon's sister, and Murat wanted his son to read and learn the French classics in books printed by Bedoni. So he commissioned Bedoni to print the French classics. And this, I'm told, was Bedoni's favorite title page, because he managed to get the words Boileau d'Espresso on one line. He had to cut special punches to do it, but he did it, and he got those 2 words on one line. Takes, all sorts of pleasures, different people. Bedoni died of complications from his gout and some kind of nasty chest infection, which his wife called catarrh, but which I think must have been, it was probably bronchitis or pneumonia. You can imagine the air he was breathing in the print works for all those years that he was working in Parma. Part of him is buried in the cathedral, and part of him is in his parish church, in this rather unpleasant way of eviscerating people and putting bits here and bits there, but that's the way it was done. So he leaves behind Gita, his wife, and she's formidable. She helped him so much while he was alive. She spoke French, and she learned English so that she could correspond with his English customers. She did all his correspondence for him. She took care of him. And he really benefited from this late marriage of his. And then the greatest thing she did was to finish work on his Manuale Tipografico, essentially his life's work. It took her 5 years. He had done, I mean, he had done the work, but it was not organized. He had written an introduction, but she had to organize the whole thing. She said herself in her own introduction that it was a labor she did not know if she could entrust to herself, but she could, and she did. So she in 1818, she brought out, and it's here, it's two volumes, they're on the middle of the table in the stand. She brought it out, and she dedicated it to the Duchess of Parma, Maria Luigia. Marie Louise she was, and now she's Maria Luigia because she's Duchess of Parma. Here is the largest type he did, and I think I may have turned. It's there. You can see it. The smallest type, right at the beginning, is he dedicates to Parma. This one he dedicates to Saluzzo, his birthplace. So essentially, he's gone full circle. The end of his great book is Saluzzo, the place he started his life. Now, you can't read this, I know that, but I have it here for a reason. This is another item in the Providence Public Library. People have always said, how many copies of the great Manuale did he print? Nobody knew. Nobody I consulted knew. This letter from Madame Bodoni to a Monsieur Durand in Metz, who was obviously a customer, said, I have printed 250 copies, and I'm selling them for 120 francs each. No discounts. She's very firm about that. This is the plaque, the memorial to him in the Parma Cathedral. It's a very big and very impressive plaque. Below is a plaque to his widow, and on the left is this, which is rather nice to know that the printers of America have acknowledged the great Bodoni. I think you may have been wondering what he looked like. This is not Bodoni. However, it was said to be Bodoni for many, many years until the clothing historians got hold of it and said he was too young in that picture to be wearing that cravat. All wrong. So here he is wearing the same cravat as a mature man. However, if you look at those two pictures side by side, it could be Bodoni. So maybe the artist was doing it from memory. I don't know. Anyway, that's one of those mysteries. Very silly, this one, isn't it? Very silly. Now we have the modern ones, which just get sillier and sillier. Look at the one on the right. Isn't it funny? I love this one. This is my favorite. There he is in his working gear, working hard. And I think that's probably a good likeness, a nice loose sketch, somebody working quickly. And here, this is in his hometown, this bust of him, and on it, it says, you may not be able to read it, says in English, the best. Can I give you 2 more minutes? Yes? I want to tell you a little bit about the experience of writing a biography of Bodoni. So, what I had not heard of Bodoni until going to a dinner party 8-9 years ago, and I was my host at this dinner party said, he was very, very upset. He'd he just heard from a dealer that he had a stolen book that he had bought in all innocence, and he had to return it to the library from which it was stolen. I, at this point, had finished the Fizz book, I'd finished the translation, and I was looking for a new topic. And I thought, oh, stolen books, that's interesting. So I looked into this particular theft. I looked into book theft in general, and it's disgusting. So I thought, I'm not dealing with that. But in the meantime, I'd become interested in Bodoni, and I wanted to go to Italy. I wanted to spend time in Italy. So I thought, ooh, this sounds like a good thing. I knew practically nothing about printing, and my Italian was like this. So I started going to Italian classes. And then the next big thing, if you want to write a biography of Bodoni, you start networking. And people put you in touch with other people. And of course, you eat Italian food. This is Sumner Stone, who put me in touch with James Moseley, the great print historian, and his wife, Gillian Riley, who is an expert on Italian cuisine. She's written the Oxford Companion to Italian Food. They were so helpful to me, both of them. My book is actually quite reliable, thanks to James Moseley, who is a very, very keen-eyed, as Stan will corroborate with me, very keen-eyed editor. And then, you get to meet Mr. Nelson, Mr. Stan Nelson, and spend a couple of days with him in West Virginia and watch him cut a punch. It was a Caslon C, as I remember, Stan, wasn't it? Yeah. And it took 5 hours to cut that one letter. And Stan is fast. So you think about Bodoni and the thousands of punches he cut. I liken him to somebody who is a nut about knitting. His hands could not be still. When he had a moment, he would cut another punch. Okay, so you go to Parma. But I think this is in 2008, or maybe 2008. Very few Wi-Fi hotspots. But there was one on the steps of the 11th century baptistry. For some reason, I never quite understood why. And I used to annoy the old priest who came out with his brush to sweep up the pigeon poo that was on the steps, and I was always sitting there, and he would glare at me, but there you go. So if you're lucky, you get to meet handsome men, and you get to converse with really charming women, and you have to get beyond the curator of the Bodoni Museum. You have to make real nice with her, and then you get to meet her assistant, who turned out to be golden. She did anything she could for me. As you can see, she's holding a fine Bodoni volume here. And she and her boyfriend would take me out at weekends. So out into the countryside to see places that Bodoni would have gone, to see the Duke's country palace at Colorno. We went to see the hunting lodge and the chapel that I mentioned before, and we would eat out. So it was lovely. You know, immediately I had an Italian friend. I did make from Gillian Riley, you remember the culinary expert, the Italian, she put me in touch with a woman called Wallis Wilda Manozzi, who is a writer who lives in Parma, married to an Italian professor. She's American. And she had a writers group, and she invited me to come and talk about biography to them. And they, because it's a small society, they sort of fell on me because I was a newcomer and started taking me out to other things. And I felt very at home in Parma. I went in a total of 5 times to Parma. So if you're lucky, you get to meet l'uomo squisito, the exquisite man, Corrado Mingardi, who is probably the greatest Bodoni scholar in Italy. Well, there's a couple of others that contestant, but Corrado Mingardi is certainly one of the top 3. And then Franco Maria Ricci is an Italian publisher and Bodoni collector of neoclassical art. And here we are looking for Bodoni in one of his cabinets with part of his collection above us. If you're lucky, like I was, you're there during Carnival. This picture is funny because the figures at the bottom are the people, and the figures at the top are the puppets. And if you're not so lucky, you get to be there during an earthquake. And I was alone in this room when the world started shaking and the windows rattled, and I thought all the books were going to fall off the shelves, but they didn't, fortunately. And we all ran outside, and it was quite dramatic. I was there during 2 winters when it snowed. And snow in Parma is, because it's not a deeply cold place, although I must say I felt very cold there sometimes, the snow will melt quite quickly and then freeze. And it's a lot of cobblestones. It is treacherous. And because I was spending every morning from 9 till 1 reading 18th century Italian in spidery handwriting, often written on 2 sides of thin pages of paper, by 1 o'clock I was like this. So, and I couldn't walk, I couldn't get exercise. So I joined a gym called Physilabor. And Physilabor was set in a palazzo. So I was in this gym with young Italian women, with a lot of them with tattoos, a third of my age. And it was really challenging. And one day, the teacher shouted at me because I had slowed down a bit. And I said to her in Italian, "I'm 70 years old." And everybody in the room went, "Oh," and burst into tears. It was so funny. It was so funny. So I was at least getting my exercise. So then if you're working on a biography of Bodoni, you have to go to Rome because you think you might find something about the 6 years he was in Rome. And I managed to get myself a little visiting fellowship for 5 weeks at the American Academy, which is very grand. But in actual fact, you can't find anything about Bodoni there because he was a lowly apprentice and he did not leave a trace. He did not, there is no trace to follow. But so what I did while I was there was I found his geography. I found where he lived in the Palazzo Valentini, and I visited that, and I found, I went to Propaganda Fide, which has now been moved to the Vatican itself, so it's now a museum where the people don't know anything, about the press. It was very disappointing. I was there during a flood on the Tiber, but this I did find, and this is the Vatican printing press. And so this is where the propaganda is printing its material nowadays. Very, very high tech. So when in Rome, right, get a haircut, right? Like the hairdressers, right? But avoid buying shoes like this.
Oh, wow.
Do you imagine walking around on the cobblestones like that? And then, if you go to Testaccio, there's a section there of streets that are named for printers. There's Via Aldo Manuzio, and there's Via Beniamino Franklin, and there is, of course, Via Giovanni Battista Bodoni. Giambattista, his name that's his full name, but it was always compressed into Giambattista. So by now you're tired, aren't you? And you see a wine shop. And so you think, I'll just go in and have a nice glass of wine. So that's it, folks.
I promised you Dazzle. I didn't know about Volare, but I have to say it's a first for the Rosenwald Group. If you'd like, we could take a few minutes for questions
Sure,
if you're not
sure,
exhausted.
sure. Happy.
And then afterwards, we'll show you the Typographia and the celebration book. When we do that, we'll ask the people on the benches to get up, push the benches, and move away so we can have you come by. And as I always say, we'll be happy to show you anything you'd like to see. And also, if you find yourself leaving, there are 2 bookmarks here advertising events at the Museum of Women in the Arts, both book arts related, that are coming up soon. But let's have questions for our speaker, if you will.
Good question. Don't you want to go to Parma now? It's lovely. It's lovely. Really lovely. Oh, I've silenced them with that last image.
I think we're exhausted. Why don't we clear the room? We'll have some time. You can talk with Valerie afterwards. But let's thank her again. That was really.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.